The keynote speaker for Laurie Lavelle Keynote is Carolyn Douglas, Executive Director, Flood and Coastal Risk Management, Environment Agency in England. Floods from rivers and seas is the second highest risk on the UK Natural Hazards National Risk Assessment after pandemic. Carolyn is responsible for leading England's preparedness and response to flooding and coastal erosion risks, including an Australian $9 billion flood defence capital program. Carolyn is an Australian, so it's fantastic, welcome back to Australia, who has worked in the UK since 2013. Prior to leaving Australia, Carolyn was the Executive Director at DSE. During this period, Carolyn undertook a number of incident management roles, including at the State Control Centre, and she also led a team of 45 Australian New Zealand firefighters to the US in 2008 to support Californian bushfire response. Carolyn will draw on her natural emergency services experience in Australia, US and UK, and her partnership work with the Netherlands and other European partners to highlight the issues facing England and the latest ways in which these issues can be tackled. The keynote speech this morning is entitled Floods in England Today, Tomorrow and Adapting for 2100. Can you please welcome Carolyn Douglas.
Thank you all. It does feel like coming back to family, as Andrew said, so it's really lovely to be here. And hopefully I can tell you a bit from the Southern Hemisphere, excuse me, to the Northern Hemisphere about what we are doing to address floods as our second highest natural hazard risk, as Mark said, and what we're doing to tackle them, and to address the impacts of climate change as we see going forward. So 1953, 70 years ago, was the biggest flood in living memory for many in England. Over 300 people perished as a result of an East Coast surge, and these are some of the photos from the period. That surge combined with high winds and a high tide to impact very much the east coast of England. The Netherlands was also devastated from the North Sea. In England, over 300 people perished. In the Netherlands, over 1,800 people perished from the same storm. That had a huge impact on a nation that was recovering from World War II, only 8 years since the end of the war. Many of the defences were breached. Tens of thousands of people were evacuated because the country was still recovering in terms of trying to rebuild the nation. The amount of funding and the amount of focus on protecting the coastline from the natural, to repair the defences, the money just wasn't going into it. It was being focused on actually rebuilding those towns and cities. So I had does this work? There we go. I had the huge privilege of being able to attend some of the commemoration services in January this year at King's Lynn for the East Coast surge, so remembering many of those who perished. And one of the huge benefits of being able to attend those commemoration services was sitting and talking to a couple of the people who were actually young children or in their early teens at the time. So they remember sitting on the steps upstairs in their houses, watching the water rise, being rescued by boats and being taken to safety. They remember knowing older neighbours who'd perished in their homes. So these sorts of things, so the impacts of floods on living memories can have a huge impact, and what we need to think about is what we can do and how we can address those impacts going forward. And that's what the benefits of learning from these sorts of floods can have. We also know that we're seeing extreme weather in many places, continuing to see, from Australia in the middle, from Germany and Belgium in 2021, which is at the bottom left-hand side of the screen for you. So where over almost 250 people died in recent history in a well-developed country. And in England itself, on the bottom right-hand side, is the River Severn from a few years ago, where fortunately we didn't have any significant deaths, but we did have significant flooding of properties, with thousands of properties flooded. And we continue to have that year on year. And we need to learn from that and think ahead as to what we can do. And we create the partnerships with the likes of yourselves, Rijkswaterstaat, the US Army Corps of Engineers and beyond, to be able to learn the lessons. So before I get into the detail of what we're doing as a nation to address this going forward, I'd just like to give a short outline. Thank you.
Climate change is causing sea levels to rise and more extreme rainfall, increasing the risk of flooding throughout the country. It's essential that we adapt now to protect people and properties from the devastating impacts of flooding. How is England adapting? Forecasting and planning. We have partnered with the Met Office to develop a flood forecasting centre to help us understand weather patterns and the impact on potential flood risk. Response. We have a sophisticated alert system providing individuals with flood warnings when their local area is at risk of flooding. Building flood defences and investing in resilience actions. Alongside natural flood management, we've built barriers, coastal defences, reservoirs and floodgates in at-risk areas throughout the country. Our flood defence programme is investing a record £5.2 billion of government funding in new schemes to better protect hundreds of thousands of properties from flooding and coastal erosion. Our £150 million Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Programme is also enabling local authorities, businesses and communities to test and demonstrate innovative practical resilience actions. Educating future generations. Through innovative approaches, we can inspire children and young people to take up careers that can make a difference, like introducing Minecraft education games to schools. We are committed to adapting England to flood risk, a risk that is exacerbated by the climate crisis. Flood and coast risk management in England. Search FCERM strategy at gov.uk to learn more.
Great. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a taster for the sorts of things I'll cover in a little bit. So just to give you a bit of background to the Environment Agency. So we are an organisation that is a statutory authority in your terms, or a non-departmental public body in English terms. Still getting used to the language in that way. And that means that we are similar to environment protection authorities here. We're a regulator for people, wildlife, protecting the environment, regulating waste, water quality and water quantity. What we also do, though, as a flood risk management agency, which is quite unique in the world, there isn't any other environment protection agencies that do that. And that means of the 12,000 staff, over half are devoted to flood and coastal erosion risk management in the country. We have a strategic overview role for managing flooding from rivers, sea, surface water, which is storm overflows for yourselves, and groundwater, of which we do get a lot of groundwater flooding, particularly at the end of winter. And just to give you an idea of the scale that we're working at, so this is Greater London imposed over Melbourne. So Greater London is about 1/6 the size of Melbourne, with almost double the population. And that's sort of replicated across the country. So the challenges we have in terms of geography, of people living very closely with industry, as well as open spaces, natural environment, trying to protect all those elements and work with the increasing population, meet the challenges of an increasing population of infrastructure, housing, health, education, and the broader community, as well as economic development, is a real challenge in a country the size of England and the scale at which we're trying to work with. So when we're working at that scale, what's the overall risk that we're trying to deal with in terms of flooding? So almost 6 million properties are at risk from flooding from rivers in the sea. Around half of those are at risk from flooding from rivers in the sea, and around half from surface water flooding. But more importantly, of all the properties in England, over 2/3 of those that are reliant on infrastructure that's at risk, and that's road, rail, water treatment plants, sewage treatment plants, electricity treatment plants. So we're also building more nuclear power plants as well as renewable energy. All of those are impacted and have to be considered about the impacts of flooding going forward. As well as that, one of the biggest challenges we face is from the surveys we do, despite all those people being at risk of flooding, despite flooding being a constant in our country, 2/3 of people who are at risk of flooding do not realise they're at risk of flooding or do not accept that they're at risk of flooding. And so the constant challenge goes on of how do you get those people to realise they're at risk? How do you get them to take action, to plan, prepare, to be able to understand that when we have walls and barriers in place, they're not protected 100%. That will only go so far. They are still at risk and still vulnerable from floods in the future. So this is a bit of an outline of the significant flood events that we've had since 2007. And so 2007 was one of the biggest floods that we've had in more recent times since the 1953 floods. And 55,000 people were affected and were without water because a water treatment plant was flooded for 10 days. So that meant distributing bottled water to those communities. And that was also a set of summer storms. So it happened in the middle of summertime in July for us. Normally flooding happens over winter, but that year it didn't. And we have learnt since then with climate change that we are getting flooding throughout the year. It isn't seasonal as people have expected in the past. It isn't that winter flooding. It's all year round. So how do we deal with that? How do we adapt to that? How do we improve the resilience of the community? And climate change is having huge impacts. So why do we need to act? We know that we are having increasing temperatures from climate change. Sea level rise has increased from the start of the century. It was about 1.5 millimetres a year to about 3 millimetres a year in the last 30 years. On average, it's about 1.5 across that century. We also know that we are having increasing frequency of storms, increasing rainfall. October was in 2020 was the wettest month on record since records began. So all of that, every time we are getting breaking river level records, breaking rainfall records when we have storms. So that shows us that climate change is having an impact. So in Dorset on the right here, we are seeing landslips, and the small town of Severnstoke on the left, which was flooded a couple of years ago, we now have a flood levy going in to protect that on a permanent basis, and I visited that just a few weeks ago. But that's not going to give them permanent protection. It will protect them from a flood of this extent, but not beyond. And I really do like this bar chart of the annual temperature increases against world events. So we can see from World War I in 1914 through to Man on the Moon in 1969, and for us, the East Coast surge in 2013, which was a more recent surge. The weather, annual temperatures are getting warmer, and as you can see, the 5 warmest years were in the last decade. So how are we being able to deal with those and address that, and deal with the consequences of those on the community? So what are we doing? We have a flood and coastal erosion risk management strategy. So we're required to produce a strategy every 5 years, and the last one that we produced, we decided to take a different approach and to look out to 2100 with that strategy. So rather than just looking at the next 5 years, we're going well beyond and setting some ambitions that will allow us to take actions long into the future. That strategy has 3 ambitions, the first of which is climate resilient places, and that is about making sure that the places that people live and work are resilient to climate change. And that means that they are thinking about the planning, the forward look, the positioning, the building and the replacement of buildings that we have, the placement of industries, and making sure it is resilient to the future. The second ambition is about making sure that the infrastructure that we all rely on to live, work, to operate is also resilient to climate change. And that means, again, thinking ahead, planning, but knowing the risk that's there. And the third ambition is about the community and understanding that the community needs to know their risk, to be resilient to that risk, to be able to plan for it and address it. And that's the wider community as well as the industries and businesses, and working with those different sectors to understand that the risk for their employees, for themselves, and how they can contribute and what they can do. So the first step in that is understanding the evidence base, so understanding the risk that is faced across the country. We have a national flood risk assessment, so the sorts of maps you have are on the left-hand side, which show the flood risk in various communities. This is London. But we have this across the country. People can put their postcode into the website and find out what their risk is if they're buying a property or if they already live there. Mind you, they always debate, it hasn't flooded in my lifetime, so, you know, it's always the challenge of like, if you believe it, it's true. We're updating those maps. So we, based on local information, local models, we have around 2,000 local models, putting those together with other updated information because they're about a decade old, and producing a new national flood risk assessment that will give us a single story of all sources of flooding for now and into the future. And that national NAFRA 2, as we call it, will be finished next year and will allow people to have even more information. Combined with that, we're producing a new coastal erosion risk mapping database and flood maps that will allow people to work out where they're vulnerable to coastal erosion as well. Alongside developing that information base, we also have a capital investment program. So I think as was outlined, we are investing £5.2 billion, which is around 9 billion Australian, in a 6-year capital program to better defend around 200,000 properties. And that builds on a previous 6-year program that we had of £2.6 billion that better protected 300,000 properties. And you'll see there's quite a cost difference there between we're double the cost for less properties being protected as a result. And that's due to inflation costs, but also we're getting into harder and harder areas to plan, prepare and protect. It's costing us more to do those protection works. They're more difficult to deal with, require more engineering. But also we've got to think differently about what we're doing. So we have to think about how we're using less carbon in what we do, and I'll get to that. Also have to think about how we're incorporating nature-based solution, natural flood measures, because we know hard engineering solutions aren't going to be the answer for us for the future. So there's some good examples here. Medmary on the left-hand side is a nature-based solution, so it's actually opening up an area of land that opening it to the sea to become tidal, that's protecting community areas alongside a levee, so allowing for flooding of tidal marshes. And the middle picture is a more traditional defence in Portsmouth and Southsea, protecting King Henry VIII's fort on the coast. And so that's the combination or challenge that we have is natural heritage that we have to protect, and listed buildings that are hundreds of years old. So how do you build schemes around them, the archaeological challenges that go alongside that. And to give you a different feel for the types of assets that we have and that we manage. So there's over 300,000 assets we're responsible for maintaining. And those assets can vary from levees along rivers, such as in the top left, instrumentation, mechanical and electrical instrumentation, small flood defences, flaps, weirs, gates, large flood coastal defences, rock groins, etc., and large major pieces of infrastructure like the Thames Barrier or like the Hull Barrier on the bottom left-hand side. Alongside that, we have to maintain all those defences, which means for levees, we have to mow them. For flood storage areas, which are dry most of the year, bizarrely, we have to maintain them and protect them, because when they are full, we need to know that they're reservoirs and that they can impound the water safely. We also carry a stock of demountable barriers and pumps that we use during response. So we had about 40 kilometres of temporary barriers. We've sent 15 kilometres to the Ukraine in their recent reservoir breach, so we won't see those again, so we have to replace those. We also have around 250 pumps, and again, we've sent a dozen of those to the Ukraine. And those pumps vary in size from 6-inch to 24-inch, and we can move them all around the country to where we need them. In terms of our overall approach to incident management, we have what we call as a forecast-led, response-driven approach. And to give us a good idea when we are might get rainfall impacting or the type of rainfall that might create flood events, we have a combined flood forecasting centre with the Met Office, which is our equivalent to the Bureau of Meteorology. That flood forecasting centre is made up of hydrometeorologists, which are people who are trained in both hydrology and meteorology. And I know we've been talking with the Bureau of Meteorology here about how we can share that training and learning with teams, because it's really important for us to know what people be able to interpret the weather, but to also be able to interpret the river hydrology and understand the impacts that could come from that. So every day that flood forecasting centre gives us a flood guidance statement, which you'll see in the middle bar there. That flood guidance statement is actually made up of our combined models coming together to tell us what the risk is at local levels and to be able to convey that risk. We share that flood guidance statement with our Category 1 responders, which are police, fire, local authorities, ourselves and health services. Those local authorities are able to then interpret or understand what are the future potential risks that they're facing on any day. We also have a 1-month and a 3-month flood outlook. We use that information to convey the risk in rivers. Alongside that, in the middle chart, sorry. What you'll see is bar charts or hydrographs of what's happening in the rivers in real time. So we have what we call Rivers Online. So in real time, communities can go online to see the impact of the rainfall on their local rivers, and they will get a forecast based on our models. You won't believe the arguments we have about the models. You said your forecast said it was going to happen at 3 o'clock and it came at 3:10. You were wrong. So we have constant debates about it's a model versus real time and trying to get local communities to understand that. But at the same time, it's really helpful for them to be able to help themselves because they can see what the forecast is. It may not be 100% accurate, but we can work with the local communities to help them understand what they're seeing and how to interpret it. And that helps them to prepare what they need to do to get themselves ready to either leave their property, to put property flood resilience measures in place, to be able to act as they need to. Alongside these warnings, we have our flood warning levels. So we have an alert, which is about telling people what they need to do to prepare, to be able to leave their home, to understand that they need to be ready to act should we give them the information. The flood warnings, which are issued, and we issue all of these levels on various stretches of river, which can be from a little as 100 metres or beyond. So they're really quite discreet depending on the flood risk. Those flood warnings tell people they need to act, which means if they have property flood resilience measures they need to put in place, and this could be doors, self-closing flaps, bungs to put in toilets, and one of the challenges that we have is for surface water or stormwater overflow, we have combined surface and sewage overflow systems, which means when you get flooding from stormwater, you get flooding with sewage in it. It's really quite disgusting, and that will be in properties. So it's not just dirty floodwater you're getting through your property, it's sewage you're getting through your property or through your business. So cleaning that up is really quite challenging. And so there's small things that cost a little as £5 that you can put in your toilets, you can put down your plug holes to stop that stormwater coming up the wrong way. And severe flood warnings are when there's a risk to life. And we do issue those rarely, but we do issue them, and we work in partnership with other emergency services to let them know when we think a severe flood warning is going to be issued. We try and give people as much time as we can, because generally there's evacuations that need to go alongside that, or we know that there is a genuine risk to life if people stay in their homes or in their local communities, and we issue severe flood warning. Alongside all of those, we have an emergency alert system which allows people, which we can issue to people on the move. And that emergency alert system is something that has only been introduced this year. It allows messages to be pinged from mobile phone masts, and that system will allow people to, we'll only generally issue it under a severe flood warning, so we know if we're issuing it, there is a risk to life. And then we work alongside other local responders to respond, to put up temporary defences, to help people through the flood event emergency as it happens. And this is the sort of thing that we do, examples of the sorts of things that we do in flood first line response. So it is about making sure that communities are evacuated. We provide pumps when we have breaches in defences, and no defence is perfect. It can be breached, it can be overtopped as well. So we need to be able to restore that and recover that when necessary. We also have our own emergency incident command vehicles on the top left that we position in various locations, A, for our own staff to use to get up-to-date information and monitor the situation, but to also be a first place for community people to come. It's quite a visible vehicle. They can come, they can talk, they can ask questions, they can get reassurance about what is or what isn't happening. So it's sort of in line with our mantra of think big, act early, be visible. It's about being there and being able to provide the advice to the community as you need it. And just to give you an idea of the sort of temporary defences that we have, and this is probably something that's a bit unusual for you, but I thought it was worth including. This is the town of Bewdley on the River Severn. And as you can see, this is the River Severn before on peaceful times, and then during flood, we put up the temporary defences, and you can see the same houses houses and businesses behind those temporary defences, people going about their business, working while the river is in flood behind those defences. And so they can go up and down. We need 24 hours notice with our field teams to be able to put those up. But as you can see, they're really effective. The community really appreciates them. It means they can continue to work. One of the challenges we have is with increasing climate change and increasing rainfall and river levels, we know that those temporary defences are going to be challenged in the future. And so what do we do when they get close to the top? We have quite a bit of freeboard at the moment, but we know it will get close to the top, and once you overtop those defences, there's a lot of water to pump out. As you can see from this river, there's a lot of water that's going to have to be put somewhere else, and it will cause a lot of damage. And that's what we face, is what do we do in the future, in the next 20 to 30 years, when we know those areas of freeboard that we have are going to be breached. So let's go. So adaptation and resilience. This is really about how are we adapting and becoming resilient for the future. We have a Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Program, as was mentioned in the video. That program is £150 million and 25 projects across the country to look at different ways that we can address flood and coastal erosion risk. Those projects are all combined local authority, community, contractor and other non-government organisational projects. So they're groups getting together who've proposed an innovative solution using technology, using sustainable urban drainage, all sorts of different things. Now we know not all of those are going to work, but the point is we'll learn from them, whether they succeed or whether they fail. We'll learn, we'll try something different, and it's great that government is choosing to invest that much money in those 25 projects over the next few years. And they've all got 5 years to operate. So they've been going for a year now. they've got another 5 in which to prove or disprove what will and won't work. So the learning from that is going to be fantastic, and we want to be able to start to harness that learning once it happens throughout the program. It won't just be at the end. We want to do it as we go. The other element that we have is, other part of this is the Coastal Transition Accelerator program, as we're calling it. So this is Haysborough, and it is one of in North Norfolk, and it's one of the areas of the fastest eroding coastlines in Europe. East Riding of Yorkshire is the other part. So you can see from the little square on the top right of both of those pictures, the amount of coastline that's eroded over the last 13 years. Those coastlines are eroding around 4.5 metres on average each year. In a big storm, you can lose 10 metres easily. And the challenge for us is there is no engineering solution to protect these. But aside from that, they're very small communities. So the cost benefit of protecting them is it's not cost beneficial. And we're required with all our projects that we can only do projects that are cost beneficial. So the challenge for us is, what do we do with these small communities? You can let the homes fall into the sea, or you can demolish them as they become close, which is what happens now. Or you can think about how we can move and relocate those communities. And so that's what we're doing. We're investing in both of these 2 locations, East Riding of Yorkshire and North Norfolk, to have a look and try and work with the communities to say, you're vulnerable, you're at risk. You know, you can see your neighbours' properties have gone. You know that it could be your property next year or the year after. How do we maintain that community fabric? How do we move you from the coastline? How do we protect you into the future? And of course, some of the answer is going to be build a wall, build some coastal defences. We can't. There are actually no engineering solutions that are viable in some of these areas, let alone cost beneficial. Just the nature of the geology is such that we can't, there's nothing we can do. So, but working with the community, we can try and find some solutions. And if we can find some solutions with 2 communities who are really vulnerable, we can apply that in other areas along the coastline to say, how can we address those and help those communities to become resilient to the future? Because this isn't going away. This is only going to increase. The other thing that we're doing is adaptation, what we call adaptation pathways. And I'm using the Thames Barrier as a good example of an adaptation pathway. So we've been working on a Thames adaptation plan, or Thames Estuary 2100, which is looking out to 2100 for the Thames tidal area. Very significant area, given it's London is in the Thames Estuary area. It was also one of the areas that was most significantly impacted after the 1953 surge that I had at the start. And as a result of the 1953 surge, the Thames Barrier was built. And that barrier protects the City of London as well as a lot of tidal areas. But it's not just the Thames Barrier that makes up the defence. There are walls and gates along the Thames that contribute to that defence. So here's the Thames Barrier in the middle, and on the left-hand side gives you an idea of what it does. The Barking Barrier in the bottom right-hand corner is part of the defence. And all of this is all up to Teddington Lock in the top left-hand corner, which is the difference between the fluvial or the freshwater Thames and the tidal Thames. And the lines on the right-hand side are on the embankment just outside London. And again, those are tidal defences. A lot of people look at them and think, what are those walls for? But actually, they're part of flood walls that protect the City of London. And the story goes that when the lines are drinking, i.e. when the water's up to the mouth of those lines, that's when we close the barrier, which is true. It's about right. But I do love the picture in the middle in terms of it does show you downstream the water being held back from the tidal area to, sort of upstream to the left. And that's a 4.5 metre tidal difference. So there's quite a significant amount of water that is being held back to protect the City of London, the infrastructure, the industry that exists there. But we're also increasingly using that barrier more for fluvial flooding. So as we get more flooding upstream, and the Thames upstream of Teddington Lock is one of the largest undefended floodplains in Europe. And we're currently working on a 600 million pound flood scheme to defend that area. But until that's in place, which will probably take us about 10 years, when we do have floods on the fluvial Thames, we hold back the tide to allow more floodwater to enter the tidal area and then allow it to exit to sea when the tide recedes. It's not what the barrier was designed for, and the challenge with that is challenging the asset life of the Thames barrier. So originally it was designed to extend to 2040, and we knew that at 2040 we'd probably have to replace it. With care and maintenance, and we do a lot of care and maintenance on it since it was opened in 1983, we've extended its life to 2070, but we do know we need to start looking now to look at where we replace and what we do with the Thames barrier into the future. And that's the beauty of the adaptive plan, the Thames Estuary 2100 plan, is the work that we've done over the last decade and the review that we've recently undertaken has shown us that because of climate change, because of the impacts that we're seeing, we need to bring forward our planning for a new barrier, for increasing those tidal defences that you see by about 15 years. So we know that sea level rise is having a greater impact than we expected, and our models and our forward plannings allowed us to now think, okay, we were going to plan for 2055, we now need to bring it back to 2040 to start thinking about what are those new defences, how much do we need to raise them by, or what are our different options for the future, because raising defences isn't always the solution. We need to think about nature-based solutions in other areas. Then the other thing that we're doing is we've committed to being a net zero organisation by 2030, and that means we need to think about our carbon footprint. As an agency, as an organisation that spends a lot of time and a lot of money on infrastructure, on building infrastructure, concrete, a lot of concrete goes into the things we build, we've had to think about how we can reduce our own footprint. So we have an all-electric fleet now, and that includes our construction vehicles. We are using low-carbon concrete and no-carbon concrete. We're in non-structural elements. So the likes of the Bridgewater Barrier on the bottom right there, that's actually a digital twin of the Bridgewater Barrier that's about to start construction. We're using low-carbon concrete in that barrier. We're also, instead of steel reinforcement, we're using basalt and carbon reinforcement. We're also making sure that wherever we can, we're using renewable energy. So we have used a lot of diesel pumps in the past, and all of our major barriers have diesel pumps as backups. Our government's mandated that diesel will be phased out by 2045. So we've got to think about what are our options for renewable energy into the future. How are we going to power those? We can't let the Thames barrier fail. It has to be able to operate if it doesn't have power. So what are our options when we don't have diesel? Recently, I was on a major dredger that was actually owned by the Dutch company Van Oord, and that was powered by liquid natural gas, not diesel. You had this massive dredger. So that's the way of the future, and that's what people are thinking about. And that's where our role in government is to think about that innovation, working with in partnership with industry, and then sharing that learning with them and making sure it becomes more mainstream. So making sure that when we do use low carbon concrete, that we're working with the British Standards Institute to make sure it meets engineering guidelines and can be used by other organisations into the future. And that helps everyone to be able to reduce carbon, to address the climate challenge that we know is impacting us all. The other element that we're looking into is natural flood management. So this is the Sturt Marshes in the Bristol Channel in the southwest. So more and more we're looking at how we can use natural flood management or nature-based solutions in combination with the hard engineering solutions. We know that nature knows how to do these things really well, and it is nature that's going to give us these challenges going forward. But we know that being able to preserve these areas, to enhance the tidal areas, as this one is, or to use leaky dams to slow the flow, to reduce the impact of floods, in combination with the hard engineering, that we can reduce the impact of flooding on the community. It will mean that communities are more resilient in the long term, that the peaks of floods are reduced. It won't stop them altogether, so nature-based solutions on their own aren't the solution, but in combination with hard engineering, we can increase the resilience of communities and reduce the impact of flooding on those communities. And we don't do it alone. We have to work in partnership with a whole range of organisations, from the private sector in Arup through to non-government organisations like the National Trust, the National Farmers Union, and insurers like Flood Re. So we, for example, have a flood reinsurance program. So since 2012, the challenge of getting insurance has been really difficult for homeowners with flooding, and I think you're facing that here as well. So government's introduced a flood reinsurer that will make sure any homes built prior to 2012, and the reason why it's 2012 is any homes built after 2012 are meant to be flood resilient, but we know that's not the case. But they can get traditional insurance for any homes built pre-2012. As part of that, Flood Re has been working with insurers to create a program called Build Back Better. And that means when homes and properties are flooded, and we know it happens, that not only are they replacing like for like, but they also give them additional monies to make their properties flood resilient in the future should the homeowner choose to. Now, they can choose not to take the money, but that does mean that they're just going to be vulnerable for the future. And we know from a lot of lessons from homeowners, if they can put in hard flooring, if they can put waterproof plaster on their walls, move their electricity points upwards, put flood barriers and doors on, that they can be back in their homes within days rather than months or years, because it does make them resilient to flooding. We've got a lot of lessons to learn from that, and we're trying more and more to be able to make that known to communities through organisations such as the National Flood Forum. So we've come a long way from flooding in the 1953 floods, which is the bottom left, to the Thames Barrier on the top right, and again another fantastic shot of the barrier holding back the tide with London upstream there. We've introduced warnings through which we didn't have in 1953. We now have those warnings, ability to warn in place. We have the modelling, the forecasting, the sophisticated systems to be able to tell people what to do, to know when they're at risk, and to hopefully know what to do when they are at risk. But there's a lot of challenges that we have ahead of us. So we need to think about the media in terms of their approach. How are they helping us and helping the communities to understand their risk, but also working with us to give the right stories and messages. Natural flood management in the bottom right-hand corner, the leaky dams that I talked about. Our infrastructure in the top middle is very vulnerable. So this is a recent train derailment as a result of simply a high tide has eroded the ballast from the rail line. So we know, for example, with increasing tides, again, climate change is having an impact on those communities and on infrastructure. And in this case, fortunately, the train driver saw the ballast had been washed away and stopped in time, so there was no damage. The train derailed, but there was no injuries or anything, and he was able to slow down significantly before that happened. In the top right is an example of property flood resilience measures, but there are many more that are much more discreet and can be built into homes, from flood doors through to the toilet bungs and stops that I talked about earlier. So all these different measures, alongside the community understanding their risk and being able to help themselves, is really quite important to be able to raise awareness, raise understanding, know what to do. And starting with children, we have a Minecraft game, which is the biggest selling electronic game across the world, I think. We've recently introduced in Minecraft education component an element that talks about flooding, talks about ecological protection, talks about biodiversity, to help children understand what they can do with flood risk. And that Minecraft education program is now in 120 countries and has reached over 2.5 million children. So what a fantastic way in gaming to give children an insight into flooding and the risk, and hopefully they'll pass that on to their parents and learning as well. And then I'd just like to leave you with this thought from someone who was brave and thinking out of the box and liked a challenge. And I think that's what we need to do to be able to tackle flood risk and flood emergencies in the future, to be able to think about the challenges ahead of us with climate change and know what to do. We do need to make some decisions, and we need to make them on a no regrets basis. And then we need to be able to have determination to act, to drive through those decisions, to be able to face what's to come and to be brave enough to continue and learn from those decisions. So when they fail, to keep going and learn from it, and to when they succeed, keep moving on as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Fantastic presentation. Now, we do have time for a couple of questions. So if we got any, is there a microphone up the back there? Yep, microphone. Hand up, any questions? Yep, over there.
Carolyn, thanks for that. Delightful. I'm interested to get your input on the introduction of beavers into the UK system. It's an article that's just popped up recently. In light of the concept of flooding, and given also your Australian experience as DSE,
Yep.
whether that's something that's a minor factor that we now need to consider that in local communities as an influence of water management?
Yeah. Well, beavers have been introduced in controlled areas, that's the theory, but they do escape, as we know, because they're wild animals. I think the challenge with beavers is, it's great, it's reintroducing what was there. Beavers did exist in England and the UK and were eradicated. So it's fantastic to have them back. I think, so the challenge for us is they were introduced, as we've learnt from Europe, from the Netherlands and Germany, they were introduced about 2 decades ago. And so we're probably a decade ahead of where they are now. So what they've seen is a lot of damage to their infrastructure as a result of the beavers because of the way they like to nest. So it's fantastic to have the wildlife, to have the biodiversity back. What we need to think about is how do we manage and protect our levees and our flood banks, etc. So they do some really good things from a natural solution, nature-based solution perspective, but then we've also put a lot of built infrastructure into the environment since they were there. So how do we blend that and make sure that we can protect that and protect the beaver going forward? They're very cute, I have to admit.
One more question. Susan, from the front.
Can you just explain, please, how that Thames flood barrier actually works?
Okay. So the barrier itself consists of, it's a series of pillars across the river. I can probably go back to it for you. Let's see if I can, it's going to go, we have to go back. It's a series of pillars across the river. Between each of those pillars is a gate that actually sits on the bottom of the river. And then when the tide, because tide's going in and out, and when we think the tide is going to be at a point that would be higher or close to the other, the tidal banks or walls that we have, we raise those gates. So let's... So you can see the pillars in the middle, and then the gates are lifted, the yellow arms, see the gates, you can just see the yellow arms are up and the gates are sitting up, and the tide is held back, and it means that you've got fresh water coming into the river, and the salty water is held, the tidal water is held back from entering that tidal area. And then when the gates close, the tide water is there, comes out, and it sort of reaches an equilibrium again. Does that make sense? It's great to see. They're the arms that lift the gates. You can just see between the pillars the gates that are it might be a bit hard to see on this screen, but they raise up. They're literally just panels that raise up between the pillars. Those pillars are pretty strong. We have had a ship run into one of them. The ship sunk. We had to get it off the gate though, that was the problem. It sunk on the gate. So the gates sit below the water to allow shipping to go back and forth.
So is there a person whose job is to push the button for the gates to...
That's the thing, yes, there is one person sort of pushes the button these days, but yeah, it's not quite the same. But these ones, the barking barrier on the right-hand side here is a gate that literally drops down to stop the water going through. So it's we've got lots of different styles that we use across the country, the tidal defence barriers, like the Thames barrier, there's about 7 or 8 of them in the world that they sort of all collaborate to make sure that they do peer reviews, that they're operating effectively, So Russia, Finland, Netherlands, and the US all have big tidal barriers like the Thames Barrier.
Another question? Up the back.
Hi, good morning. My name is Natalia. Thank you for the presentation. In the beginning, you mentioned about the ambition that a long plan for climate resilient places. I'm just curious, is that any plan like step by step? Because it's really big plan, and is there anything already applied for, like, for example, is there any intensive for the building because they have to change the material, change the position of the building, or is that building code, or what is the step by step to reach that big goal? Thank you.
Yeah, the first step we're starting with is obviously the planning, so the location of those buildings. So we try to not to encourage building in the floodplain. The challenge we know is that there isn't a lot of land to go around in England, so there is building on the floodplain. There's already houses that exist and properties that exist in the floodplain and businesses, so that will happen. What we try and do when the planning decisions are made for those buildings is that they are able to manage to flood risk, so cater for flood risk. So there are building codes for flood resilient properties, so building British standards which mandate waterproof plaster, the positioning of electricity supply sort of quite high up the walls, non-return valves on drainage, etc., etc. So those sorts of things are already in place. Getting building and suppliers and contractors housing contractors to comply with those is a real challenge, and getting communities or individuals to want those in their properties is also the other challenge. So there's a lot of work going on to promote it. I think we've got a long way to go to work at that individual level with communities. What we also try and do, particularly with bigger industry, is to make sure that they are protecting themselves. So infrastructure have to put in their own flood resilience measures, whether it's small walls or levees around their properties, but they can't impact on others. So there's a challenge there. And it all starts with the planning.
One more question in the middle here.
Hi, Caroline. It's Belinda Wong from DTP. Thanks for all your work in protecting the communities in the UK, first of all. I'm just wondering, are there any trade-offs in terms of meeting the net zero targets in terms of building all the operating assets that you had? You mentioned you had to substitute some of the materials that are used. Probably a lot I could go into outside here. I think the challenge is in some ways it's an immature industry, so we're doing a lot to trial different methods and techniques and to promote that in the wider industry. I think it is about making things more mainstream, so the fact that we now have an all-electric fleet, a lot of the contractors we use are all electric, helps to sort of start, every small thing will make a difference. So, we're not all going to be able to change everything at once. So the trade-off is we can't necessarily do it all, but every small thing that we do, whether it's renewable energy on sites, whether it's electric vehicles, whether it's low carbon or no carbon concrete, all of that will make a difference cumulatively. And so that's what we've got to get the entire sector looking at and working on, not just ourselves. And that being government, we can help to drive and have the right messaging. But there's more we can do. There's a lot more innovation. I always try and think about it like when President John F. Kennedy said that he was going to put a man on the moon and back by the end of the decade. NASA didn't know how they were going to do it at the start of the decade, but they absolutely did it. And they didn't give up when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. I sort of think like we're in 2023, we said we're going to be net zero by 2030. A lot of our teams are saying, we're not going to get there. And it's like, yeah, we don't have all the answers yet, but we've got to keep trying, we've got to keep going. We might not make it, but it doesn't mean we're not going to have a go. And that's where, for me, bringing the Australianness of into the UK sort of culture is, we need to have a go and have a try at it, and that's what is really encouraging.
Thank you, Carolyn. We've just got a small thank you card here, and on behalf of the committee, we make a small donation to the Emergency Services Foundation. So can you please put your hands together and thank Carolyn?